My name is Sam Whitfield. I'm 32 years old, and I need to tell you something I've never said out loud to another living person. Not to my mother, not to a priest, not even to the woman I eventually married. I need to tell you about the fire. I was standing across the street when it happened, close enough to feel the heat pressing against my face like a hand, close enough to hear the glass in the front window cracked from the inside out, close enough to smell scorched espresso beans mixing with burning wood in a way I can still taste sometimes when I close my eyes. And the whole time I stood there in the orange light with my hands shoved in my pockets. One single thought kept circling in my head like a moth that wouldn't leave the porch light alone. I know who did this. I don't have proof. I never had proof. But I have a guess. And it's the kind of guess that doesn't let you sleep. Because the person I suspect isn't a stranger. It's someone I loved like a brother. And the reason I suspect him is the same reason I never said his name out loud to the fire marshal, to the sheriff, to anyone who asked. Because if I told the truth about what led to that fire, I'd have to tell the truth about myself, too. Before I take you back to the beginning, you should know a little about who I was before any of this happened, because it matters for what comes later. I ran the framing shop 2 doors down from where the hardware store still stands. A small business my uncle left me when he retired to Florida. Mostly picture frames and the occasional custom job for the school and the church bulletin board. Quiet work, the kind that leaves your hands busy and your evenings empty. I was 30 years old that fall, and I had been alone longer than I liked to admit. Not lonely in any dramatic way. Just unaccompanied. The way a house is unaccompanied, when nobody's turned a light on in the front room in a while. I tell you this because I want you to understand that I wasn't a bad man walking into that autumn. I was an ordinary one, a little hungry for something I couldn't name yet. And ordinary men do things in the grip of that hunger that they never would have predicted about themselves. So let me take you back to the beginning, back before the smoke. Back before any of us knew what we were capable of when it came to wanting something, or someone, badly enough. It was the middle of September when Daniel Cross rolled into Ashford, Vermont, in a truck that still had dealer plates on it, and within a week he'd talked my oldest friend, Jonah Reyes, into going in halves on the empty storefront next to the hardware store on Main Street. Jonah and I had grown up 2 houses apart, the kind of friendship that starts before either of you can remember starting it, and when he called me that week, his voice had a lift in it I hadn't heard since before his father died. "We're opening a cafe," he said, like it was the most natural sentence in the world. "Me and a guy named Daniel. You'll like him. Everybody likes him." And that was true. That was the maddening thing about Daniel. Everybody did like him. The easy laugh, the way he remembered the names of people's dogs, the way he could walk into the diner, a stranger on Tuesday, and walk out on Thursday like he'd been raised there. I watched the 2 of them gut that old storefront over 6 weekends, tearing up rotted floorboards, hauling in a second-hand espresso machine that Daniel had driven for hours to buy off a closing restaurant in Burlington, and by the first week of October, they had a sign hanging above the door, hand-painted. The letters slightly uneven because Jonah had insisted on doing it himself. Ember and Oak, it said, and underneath it, smaller, a line Daniel had suggested, where the town comes to slow down. I want you to understand something about Ashford before I go further, because the size of a town matters to a story like this. 4,000 people, 1 blinking light at the center of town, a diner, a hardware store, a church with a steeple you could see from any road heading in, and a harvest festival every October that the whole county circled on the calendar. In a town that size, there's no such thing as a private heartbreak. Everyone knows everyone's business 2 days before they know it themselves. So when Claire Bennett walked into Ember and Oak on its opening morning, still wearing the black she'd worn to her father's funeral 3 weeks earlier, the whole town noticed, because everyone in Ashford had loved Walter Bennett, the man who ran the feed store for 40 years and never once raised his voice at a customer. Claire was his only daughter, and grief had made her quiet in a way that unsettled people, who remembered her laughing behind the counter at her father's store, calling out prices from memory, teasing the farmers who came in every week for the same feed order. People in Ashford kept bringing her casseroles for weeks after the funeral, the way small towns do when they don't know what else to offer. And Claire told me once, much later, that she'd started to dread the sight of a covered dish on her porch because it meant one more conversation where she had to comfort someone else about her own father's death. Jonah was the one who took her order that first morning, and he told me later that when he set the coffee down in front of her, she looked up and said, "Thank you for opening this place. My father would have loved it." And then she started crying so quietly that Jonah didn't know whether to comfort her or pretend not to notice. So he did both, badly, and she laughed through the tears at how badly he did it. That was how it started with Jonah. Slow, careful, built out of small kindnesses. A second cup of coffee he never charged her for, a chair he saved for her by the window without ever saying he was saving it. He started remembering things about her father that she hadn't told him herself. Small things he'd picked up from other people around town, and he'd bring them up gently, at exactly the moments grief seemed to be pressing hardest on her. "Your dad taught my little cousin how to fix a tractor engine for free. One afternoon, took him 3 whole Saturdays." And Claire had gone still at the counter, her hand wrapped around her cup, and said, "That sounds exactly like him. He never once let anyone pay him back for anything." And Jonah had said, Quiet, not looking at her directly, must be where you get it. Always leaving a bigger tip than the bill calls for. And she'd laughed, surprised at herself for laughing, and told him that was the first time in 3 weeks she'd laughed about anything connected to her father without it hurting first. He never pushed her to talk. That was the thing about Jonah that made him dangerous in the gentlest possible way. He simply made himself available, again and again, until being near him started to feel like the only hour of her day that didn't ache. But Daniel noticed her too, and where Jonah was careful, Daniel was direct. He asked her to help him choose paint colors for the back wall. He asked her opinion on pastry recipes. He found reasons to walk her to her car in the evenings when the shop closed. And here's where I need to bring myself into this properly. Because up until that point I'd been nothing but a friend standing at the edge of the story. The guy who came in for coffee and stayed to help fix a leaking pipe under the sink. But Claire had a friend named Maya Ellison. And Maya started coming by the cafe most afternoons to walk Claire home. And the first time I saw her she was laughing at something Jonah said. Her head tipped back, dark hair catching the light through the window. And I felt something shift in my chest that I hadn't felt in longer than I wanted to admit. I introduced myself clumsily, over a display case of scones, telling her my name twice by accident because the first time came out as barely more than a mumble, and she laughed, not unkindly, and said, "I heard you the first time, Sam," and something about the way she said my name, like she'd already decided to keep it, made the rest of that afternoon feel lighter than any afternoon had in a long time. We talked for 20 minutes that first day about nothing at all, the weather turning, whether the maple out front would drop its leaves before the festival, and when she finally stood to leave she said, "I'll probably be back tomorrow." Claire never remembers to eat lunch on her own, and I told her I'd probably be back which wasn't true. I usually ate at my workbench, but I rearranged my whole week around the chance of seeing her again. I want to be honest with you here, because honesty is the only thing I have left to offer at this point in my life. Maya liked Jonah, not the way Claire was starting to like him. Nothing that deep yet, but a warm, hopeful kind of liking. The kind that hadn't been tested by anything, and so still felt light and easy. She'd tell me about it sometimes, sitting across from me at the counter while Claire and Jonah talked by the register. She'd say things like, "He's steady, you know, in a good way." And I'd nod and agree with her and feel something curl up tight and small inside my stomach every single time. I told myself for weeks that what I felt for Maya was simple, the kind of thing that would resolve itself naturally if I was just patient. I was wrong about that, and I was wrong about a lot of things that fall. But that was the first lie I told myself, and it wasn't the last. October deepened. The maples along Main Street turned the color of the fire that would come later, though none of us could have known that yet, and the Harvest Festival began creeping closer on the calendar, the way a deadline creeps closer on a project. "You haven't started?" Claire's visits to the cafe grew longer. She'd stay after closing sometimes, helping Jonah wipe down the counters, and I watched him change in small ways, standing up straighter when she walked in, laughing louder at things that weren't especially funny. Daniel watched it too, and I could see something tighten behind his easy smile, though he never said a word about it, not yet. What he did instead was invite Claire to help him source pumpkins from a farm 2 towns over. An entire Saturday spent together while Jonah worked the register alone, and when they came back that evening Claire's cheeks were flushed from the cold, and she was laughing at something Daniel had said. And I watched Jonah's face do something complicated, something that looked like a door quietly closing. That night I made a decision that I have spent every day since trying to justify to myself, and I have never quite managed it. I decided that if Claire chose Jonah, Maya's attention would drift naturally away from him, and towards someone else. And I decided, without ever admitting it to myself in those exact words, that the someone else should be me. So I started doing small things. I mentioned to Claire, casually, over coffee one afternoon, when Maya wasn't around, how much Jonah had talked about her father, how he'd told me once that Walter Bennett was the reason the bank hadn't taken his own family's land years before any of this started. A story that was true, every word of it true. But I told it to her at exactly the moment I knew it would land hardest. 3 days before the anniversary of her father's death, when grief had her at her softest. I want you to notice that I'm not telling you I lied. I'm telling you I told the truth at the times and in the ways that served me best. And if you've never done that yourself, consider yourself lucky. Because it is a quieter kind of dishonesty than an outright lie, and it is so much harder to confess. Claire started spending more time at the cafe after that. More time near Jonah specifically. And I watched Maya notice the shift the way you notice weather changing. Slowly, and then all at once. She stopped mentioning Jonah's name as easily as she used to. She started arriving at the cafe a little later, staying a little less time. There was an afternoon. I remember it clearly because it was the first time I let myself believe it might actually work. When Maya came into the framing shop with a photograph of her grandmother that needed mounting, and she stood at my counter longer than the job required, running her finger along the edge of the frame samples, and she said, almost to herself, "I don't know why I keep waiting around that cafe like something's going to change." And I said, "Careful, quiet, maybe you're just waiting in the wrong place." And she looked up at me like the sentence had landed somewhere she hadn't expected, and neither of us said anything else about it that day. but she came back 3 days later for a frame she didn't actually need. And I was there, every single time, ready with a joke or a ride home or a reason to stay a few extra minutes, filling the space she left behind with myself, patient as a man laying bricks. By the last week of October, 4 days before the Harvest Festival, Maya and I had started spending our evenings together without Claire or Jonah at all, walking the length of Main Street in the cold, and she told me one night, quiet, almost embarrassed, that she thought she'd been imagining something with Jonah that was never really there. I told her that happens to everyone, that feelings can be honest and still be wrong about their target. And she looked at me like she was seeing something for the first time. And I let her look, because I wanted her to see it. Meanwhile, Daniel's patience with the whole situation was running out. I saw it happen in real time, standing behind the counter, restocking napkins. The day Daniel asked Claire, in front of Jonah, whether she'd go with him to the festival, and Claire, caught completely off guard, looked at Jonah first. An instinct so small and so telling that everyone in that cafe felt the temperature of the room drop. She said she needed to think about it, and Daniel nodded like it was nothing, but his jaw was tight the rest of the afternoon. And Jonah didn't say a word to either of them. He just kept wiping down a counter that was already clean. The Harvest Festival arrived 2 days later. The whole town gathered on the green behind the church. Strings of amber lights hung between the oaks, cider steaming in paper cups. A bonfire someone had built too large for its own good, crackling at the center of everything. Claire came alone, in the end, having told Daniel gently that she wasn't ready to call it a date, and I watched Jonah find her within 10 minutes of her arrival. The two of them standing near the cider stand with their shoulders almost touching, not quite. Maya and I walked the length of the festival together, past the pie competition table, past a group of kids racing each other with sparklers, and when the band started something slow near the bonfire, she looked at me and asked if I danced. And I told her badly, and she said that was fine. She wasn't looking for good. We danced badly together in the firelight for the length of one whole song, and somewhere over her shoulder I could see Daniel standing alone near the edge of the crowd, a cup of cider going cold in his hand. Watching Claire and Jonah the way a man watches a door close slowly from the wrong side of it, I felt something ugly and small flicker in my chest at the sight of him standing there alone. Not quite pity, something closer to satisfaction, and I hated myself for it, even as I let Maya rest her head against my shoulder and didn't step away. Later that night, walking Maya home under a sky gone completely clear and cold, she told me she thought something had shifted in her, that whatever she'd felt for Jonah back in September had quietly become something else, something that looked a lot like what was standing in front of her right now. And I kissed her for the first time on her porch step with the last of the bonfire smoke still caught in both our coats. And I told myself that whatever came next, at least this part was real. That night, after close, I stayed behind to help stack chairs, and I watched the two men I considered my closest friends stand on opposite sides of the espresso machine they'd bought together, not speaking, the silence between them so heavy it felt like a physical thing pressing down on the room. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them had to. 2 days before the Harvest Festival, everything broke open at once. Claire came by in the late afternoon to drop off a pie for the shop, and Daniel, maybe sensing he was losing ground he couldn't afford to lose, asked her directly, in the middle of the cafe, whether there was something happening between her and Jonah. I was in the back room, close enough to the doorway to hear every word, and I remember thinking, this is it, this is the moment, and some small ugly part of me was almost relieved, because whatever happened next would push Claire further toward Jonah and further away from any lingering claim on Maya's heart. Claire didn't answer right away. She looked at Jonah, who had gone very still behind the counter, and then she said, quietly, I don't know yet, Daniel. I'm still figuring out what I feel, and I'm sorry if that's not fair to you. It was an honest answer. It was also, in its own way, an answer. Daniel's face did something I'd never seen it do before, something raw underneath all that easy charm, and he said, low, almost to himself, of course it's him. It was always going to be him, wasn't it? And Jonah finally spoke, telling him that wasn't fair, that nobody had planned any of this. And Daniel laughed, a short, bitter sound, and said something about how convenient it must be, being the one everybody already loved before any of them ever walked into this town. That was when Jonah set down the rag he'd been holding. And I want you to understand, these were two men who had built something together with their own hands over 6 weekends, who had painted a sign together, who had opened bank accounts together, and in the space of about 90 seconds, all of that came apart. Claire left in tears, unable to watch it happen, and once she was gone, the two of them stopped pretending to be having a conversation at all. Daniel said Jonah had used their friendship as a way in with her from day one. Jonah said Daniel had never once considered that maybe Claire simply preferred him, that it wasn't a strategy, it was just how she felt. And Daniel shoved him, not hard, but hard enough that Jonah's hip caught the edge of the counter and rattled the row of mugs hanging above it. And Jonah shoved back harder, and for a few terrible seconds, Two grown men who had known each other less than 2 months, but built a business together anyway, were grabbing fistfuls of each other's shirts beside a display case full of pastries neither of them had the heart to sell anymore. A tray of cups went over and shattered against the tile, a sound so loud in that small space that for a moment none of us moved at all. And I remember Daniel's knuckles catching the corner of Jonah's jaw, not a real punch. More of a glancing thing born out of two men who had never actually fought anyone in their lives. But it was enough to draw a thin line of blood, and Jonah touched his own jaw afterward like he couldn't quite believe what had just happened to it. I got between them, finally, my hands flat against both their chests, shouting at them to stop, and they did stop, breathing hard, staring at each other across the small space I'd made between them, and Daniel was the one who said it first, voice shaking, that he was done, that he wanted out, that he couldn't stand behind a counter with a man who'd let him believe they were friends while working an angle. The whole time, Jonah didn't argue. He said fine, and that was the whole conversation. 2 words, fine, and it's done. They called a lawyer 3 days later, dissolved the partnership inside a week, and on a Thursday evening in early November, with the Harvest Festival already behind them, unattended, unremembered by either of them, they met at the cafe one final time to divide up what little there was left to divide. The till, the lease paperwork, a few pieces of secondhand furniture. I was there too, because Jonah asked me to be. And I remember the two of them moving around each other in that small space, like strangers. Careful, cold, polite in the worst possible way. The way people are polite when they've stopped caring enough to be anything else. We locked the door behind us a little after 9 that night. The sign above the door, Ember and Oak, still hung there, crooked slightly on its left hook, the way it had been since Jonah first put it up, and none of us looked back at it as we walked to our cars. I want to tell you now about the part I still can't make peace with, no matter how many nights I've turned it over in my head. Somewhere close to midnight that same night, a fire broke out inside the cafe. Nobody was inside. The wiring behind the espresso machine had always been a little temperamental. That much everyone agreed on, but the fire marshal's report, when it finally came weeks later, called the cause undetermined, which is a phrase that gives everyone in a small town permission to build their own private theory. I was the one who saw the light first. An orange flicker behind the front window that didn't look like anything until suddenly it looked like everything. And I called it in and stood across the street while the volunteer fire department worked to keep it from spreading to the hardware store next door. And it was there, in that orange light, hands shoved deep in my coat pockets, that the thought first arrived and never fully left again. Daniel had been the last one out of the building that night, locking the door himself while Jonah and I stood in the parking lot. He'd gone back inside for something, he said later, a jacket he'd forgotten, and he'd been in there alone for almost 10 minutes. I never told the fire marshal that detail. I never told anyone, not even Jonah, though I suspect Jonah worked it out on his own, because in the days after the fire, when the sheriff came around asking routine questions, Jonah answered every one of them in a way that gently, steadily pointed toward Daniel without ever accusing him outright, mentioning the argument, mentioning how upset Daniel had been, mentioning that Daniel had been the last one inside. I stood beside him during more than one of those conversations and said nothing to contradict it. The deputy who handled most of it was a heavy-set, patient man named Walsh who'd known both Jonah and me since grade school, and he came by the framing shop twice that week, sitting on the stool by my register with his hat in his hands, asking questions in the unhurried way of someone who'd already half made up his mind about the answer before he asked. He asked me about the argument, whether I'd witnessed it firsthand, whether Daniel had made any threats, and I answered every question honestly, word for word, because none of the facts themselves were lies. It was only the shape I let them take once they left my mouth. And in one conversation, when Walsh asked me directly whether I thought the fire was an accident, I said I honestly didn't know, but that Daniel had seemed like a man who'd lost everything that week, and men in that condition do things they wouldn't otherwise do. I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment, because I have had to sit with it for years. I never said Daniel started the fire. I made sure I never had to. But I made sure, too, that anyone listening would draw the only conclusion available to them. And I did it because a town's suspicion falling on Daniel meant a town's sympathy gathering around Jonah. And Jonah's healing meant Claire's healing alongside him. And somewhere far beneath all of that, in a place I didn't examine too closely at the time, it meant Maya had one less reason to ever look back toward a man everyone now quietly considered capable of burning down his own dream out of jealousy. Daniel left Ashford 11 days after the fire. He didn't say goodbye to Jonah. He came to see me the night before he left, which surprised me more than almost anything else that fall. And he sat across from me at the diner counter, both of us nursing coffee. Neither of us drank. And he said, quiet, tired, in a voice that had lost every trace of the easy charm that used to fill a room, "You don't think I did it either? Do you, Sam? Everyone in this town already has. I can feel it every time I walk into the hardware store." And I looked at him for a long moment before I answered, because some part of me wanted to tell him the truth right then. Wanted to say, I don't think you're the only one who might have done it. But I said instead that I didn't know what to think, which was, God help me. The truest sentence I said to anyone that whole autumn. because by then, I genuinely didn't know. And some nights I still don't. He asked me one more thing before he left the diner that night, whether Jonah had ever really been his friend or just a means to an end, a business partner he'd been using to feel like he belonged somewhere, and I told him I thought Jonah had cared about him, once, before all of it. And Daniel nodded like that was both the kindest and the saddest thing anyone had said to him in weeks. He left the next morning in the same truck he'd arrived in, dealer plates long since replaced, and nobody in Ashford ever saw him again. Though every so often someone claims a cousin ran into him working a bar in Portland or a marina in Maine, stories that shift a little every time they're told, the way stories do in a town that never quite finished deciding what it believed. Claire chose Jonah that winter, slowly, the way people choose things when they're still healing from something else entirely. And I watched them build a quieter kind of life together over the following year. No cafe this time, just an ordinary house on the edge of town with a porch light that stayed on late. Maya and I were married the following autumn, almost exactly a year after the fire, in a ceremony small enough that half the town complained about not being invited, and I have loved her every day since, with a devotion that still sometimes frightens me, because I know exactly what I did to make room for that love. And I have never told her, not once. Not even on the nights when the guilt sits so heavy in my chest that I have to get up and stand on the porch just to breathe around it. Here is the confession underneath the confession, the one I said at the very start I'd never spoken aloud to anyone. I don't actually know who started that fire. I told you a story tonight that points toward Daniel. The same story I let this whole town believe for years. The same story that let Jonah walk free of suspicion, and let Claire fall in love with a clear conscience, and let me finally have Maya to myself. But there was another person who locked up that cafe that night, who had spent 6 weeks watching his own quiet plan bend and twist and finally succeed exactly as he'd hoped, who had every reason in the world to want that building gone, erased, no longer standing there as a monument to two friendships he'd helped destroy for his own reasons. I am not saying I started that fire. I want to be careful here, because this is the one line I won't cross, even now, even in a confession. But I am saying I have never once, not for a single night in all these years, been entirely certain that I didn't, because there's a stretch of about 20 minutes that night, walking back to my truck alone after we locked the door, that I genuinely cannot account for, not to you, not to Maya, not to myself. Maybe it was Daniel, grieving and furious in a building that had held all his hope for a new life. Maybe it was faulty wiring behind an old espresso machine, exactly the way the report said, no villain at all, just bad luck arriving at the worst possible moment. Or maybe, and this is the thought that finds me at 3 in the morning more often than I would ever admit in daylight, there was a man who had learned that fall exactly how far he was willing to go to get what he wanted, and who understood, on some level he still hasn't fully forgiven himself for, that a burned building makes a much cleaner ending than a business that simply fails. The town rebuilt eventually, the way small towns do. A new storefront went up where Ember and Oak used to stand, an insurance office now, beige carpet, fluorescent lights, nothing that would ever make anyone cry over a cup of coffee. Jonah and Claire walk past it, sometimes without seeming to notice it at all, and I've wondered more than once whether that's a mercy or just another kind of forgetting. Walter Bennett's feed store still stands at the edge of town, run now by a cousin who never quite fills the space the way Claire's father used to, and every October, when the Harvest Festival lights go up between the same oaks, I feel my stomach tighten a little, the way you flinch near a stove you've been burned on before. Whether or not the burner's actually on, Jonah asked me once, years later, sitting on his porch with a beer neither of us had touched much, whether I thought Daniel really did it, and I said what I always say, that I didn't know. And Jonah looked out at the yard for a long moment and said, sometimes I think it doesn't even matter anymore. The building's gone either way. And I remember thinking, sitting there beside him, that he had no idea how much it still mattered to me, every single day, in ways I could never explain to him without losing him as a friend all over again. I have Maya. I have the life I built by nudging every other life around me into the shape I needed. We have a daughter now, 2 years old. And some nights, rocking her back to sleep, I catch myself wondering what I'll tell her someday if she ever asks me how her parents fell in love. Whether I'll give her the version everyone in Ashford already believes, or whether some far-off night, older and tired enough to stop protecting myself, I'll tell her the truth the way I'm telling it to you now. And some nights, lying beside Maya, listening to her breathe, steady and unaware of everything I carried to get us here. I think that's the real fire this story left behind, not the one that took down a cafe on Main Street, but the one that's been quietly burning in me ever since. Low and steady, the kind you can live with for years if you never look at it directly, the kind that only shows itself, orange and flickering, in the very last moments before you finally decide to tell someone the truth,